Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Substance Teacher webinar. So happy to be back, and this week we are going to take a look at some hard surface techniques inside of Substance Designer. So we're going to specifically take a look at a sci-fi material panel, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through the creation process, and we're going to talk some tips and techniques. Also, we're going to take this into Unreal Engine and take a look at the rendering setup. So here, let me switch my screen. So here we are, we're now looking at Substance Designer, and this is going to be the material walkthrough that we're going to do. So this is just a sci-fi panel that I created just to kind of demonstrate some of these various techniques. So again, if anyone has any questions, just please be sure to place them there in the live chat window. I'm going to be monitoring that as we go. So if you have any questions, we can take a break and answer those as we move through this material. So let's just get started. So let's see here. Let's take a look at the graph. You'll see that I basically have one graph here, and then I also have this second graph, which is just going to be a utility for creating hoses, and we'll take a look at that. But overall, the substance itself, if we just kind of zoom out and look at the graph, you'll notice it's not really overly complex. So again, you can get a lot of intricate detail without really having to do a ton of work. And you can see that I tried to really organize this graph so it's easily readable. Also, I have this on Substance Share, so you can download this and take a look at all of the source file. So like I said, and I usually talk about this as I work, the first thing that I like to do when creating a substance is that I start directly with my base material. So here what I'll do, like I said, is I'll create my base material. I'll do a quick search for this and grab my base material. And if I right click and just drag and drop this here into the 3D view, you can see that it shows up. Now here we're seeing this emissive channel because the reason that's happening is because before I had my outputs, and if I zoom out and we'll take a look here, we zoom out, I did have this emissive channel that you see here, and that's what was fed to the shader. Now when I added this new base material, it did not have any emissive information, so when I replaced it by just doing a simple drag and drop here, if we look at our materials and we come over here to our channels, this emissive information is not being set. So what I can do here is just do, let's see, a reset to default colors. There we go. And now I'll just right click and drag and drop this guy back in. So that just really clears out the whole shader. All right, so we start, like I said, with my base material, and then I just think about the type of material I'm going to create. So here in this particular case, it's going to be a metal. So I could just use one of my presets that I have, but in my case, I have it set to custom, and I set just like a custom metal color. Maybe I'll just pull the value down a bit, have this set to metallic, and then I can adjust my roughness and so on. So this gives me like my modeling material. And I always work with the height information first and then move towards color information towards the end of my graph. So this gives me the ability to focus really on what I feel matters most, which is like your height, your normal, your roughness, ambient occlusion, all of these types of maps that really describe the surface attributes. And this is something I've talked about a lot during our webinars. And I find that it really helps me in terms of material creation. So like I said, always start height first and work my way through it. And you can see here I'm starting simple, just different shapes, compositing them together until here we get into what I refer as the map creation stage, which you can see here is where I start extrapolating maps such as ambient occlusion, normal, this here is my height. And then from there, I go into a material layering phase where you can see I'm starting to add materials and compositing things as I finally output here to my, final outputs. So like I said, we're going to start grayscale height information first. And when I do this, I'll start with my base material. So once I have this ready, then we can start looking at some actual shapes here. So one of the first things I want to talk about is just kind of a quick way to make some procedural panels. And so here's how we're going to do this. And I've got this set here in this panels section. So what I do is I start with just the shape node, and I use this node a lot. you'll notice here that I've got this node set all the way at 64 by 64. Now, this is an optimization technique. And the idea was when I first start my substance, I don't worry about trying to do any type of optimization. I just put the nodes down and I just work. And, the whole idea is I want to just create the material. After it's completely done is when I go back through the entire graph and do this optimization test where I start to see, hey, could I take this node and could I possibly have it generate at a lower resolution so it's faster to compute, which means the entire graph is going to work more quickly when I'm adjusting user parameters? Are there nodes that I can reuse? If so, I need to do that, and so on. So that's kind of what you're seeing here is the kind of the result of that optimization phase. So for example, what I had here was just this square. And instead of letting this compute at whatever resolution I set at, like in this case it's 1024 for just a white square, I decided that I would knock this down to 64 by 64. Now, the way I come up with that number is I visually just drop it down as low as I can. Now, if I started to drop this any lower than 64 by 64, I started to see kind of a degrading of the overall effect that this was producing. So it started to get more blurry, more choppy looking and all that. So I was like, okay, so basically at 64, 64 by 64 from, let's say, 512, 512, I didn't really see a huge difference in quality. So I let it, instead of keeping it at 512, I dropped it down to 64 and so on. So what you do here is you have your node selected. Under your base parameters, just set it here to absolute. And then the very next node, you'll notice that instead of having this guy set to be relative to parent, which it is by default, whenever you create a node, I set it to be relative to input. I'm sorry, guys, I didn't mean to confuse you there with that. Here, let me do this. Let me just grab a splatter. What I use, just splatter circular. So you'll notice I create this node here, and by default, it's set to input, relative to input. So you can see that if I took this node that's locked at absolute, 64 by 64, and I plug it in, it's just passing that information along. So what I'll do is I'll just set this guy to be relative to parent so that this node and all the subsequent nodes after it will get their resolution based on whatever this parent resolution is. And like I said, in order to get that, it's just really a matter of visually just dropping the resolution until you see, oh, all right, you know what, there's the bottom there. If I go any lower, it really starts to look bad resolution-wise. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here with this simple shape. Then what I did was I took this and I just ran it through the splatter circular node, and you saw that I just added that node. And then I just did some adjustments, just some things like my number and my radius. And what I do is I just kind of played around with these until I got some type of randomized pattern that looks like this. And I wasn't really going for a specific pattern. I was just trying to find something. And so that's what I have here. Now, let's see, I'm just thinking nothing really sticks out so much in the settings here that's something really important. Again, like I said, you can just play around with these settings and find something. The idea was just to randomly copy this shape to get some type of pattern like this. Now you'll notice here's one thing that I do want to point out. I do have this here, just so we don't, let me just copy these guys, and I'm going to move them over here. There we go. Just because I didn't want it to have to recompute everything. So one thing that I'm using here that's pretty cool, and a lot of nodes will have this. Here, let me just get this guy to compute here in my 2D view. All right, so like I said, we're still looking at the splatter circle. Towards the bottom here, there's this pretty nice parameter here for luminance random. So you can see that if I take this down to 0 and luminance scale, it's because of the scale settings I have, it's just basically everything is like washing there to white. And you'll notice that I have like this blending mode set to max as well. So now what I can do is just introduce some luminance random, so it's basically kind of randomizing that luminance range, which in turn kind of gives you this illusion of depth. And then you can luminance by scale to get something even more different. And you'll notice here that I'm going to get a different effect in my panel system, but just by changing these sliders. So I would say those are probably the most important settings there. So just like with any procedural texture, I always feel that variation is always key. So here, instead of creating another splatter circular and making some different changes, it's a bit more optimized just to do a transform node and just rotate or just flip it, just give it a different direction. And then take those two variations here and then just, I did a multiplied blend mode to get this result. So here's what we had before, the original. Here's the background, just the rotated version, and then we're multiplying these guys together to get this effect. Then we can start to play around with our edge detect. So if I run an edge detect on this, you can see that now I'm starting to get these cool shapes here, thinking of like a panel or a circuit board. That's the shapes that I'm getting. And then once again, just ran a transform on it just to rotate the shape. And this is being fed into my background, and then here I've just added another blend where I've got that original shape, and then you'll notice here I'm just doing a multiply over top. So again, it's step by step starting to build up this pattern that I'm working with. And like I said, if you always take these steps little by little and you move them, you'll get, you're just adding complexity as you go. So here is what we have so far. Then here you'll see I'm just using a transform again just to mix things up. I did that just because I like this kind of pattern a little bit more than this one. I just wanted to rotate it. And then run an edge detect on this. And now you can see that here we're getting an even more complex cutout system here for this kind of circuit board or panel board, basically. And it's a bit more detailed. And then you can see here that I just ran a histogram range on that because, and I'll show you what I'm doing with this, is I'm using this histogram range to kind of move this guy more like I'm thinking of it more like a depth slider. So here, let me show you how that's going to work. So like I said, we're going to use our base material here. So if I were to, whoops, let me get rid of that node. Let's grab these guys and let's just move them down over to where we have our base material. So when I start to check this shape, so I've got this shape and now I want to see what this is doing in terms of how it's going to relate to my surface. Here I'm going to come over to my base material, and underneath my user defined maps I'm going to enable my normal and I'm going to enable my height. So I need to just plug this guy here into my height, and then I also need to generate a normal for this. So here you can see I'm just going to use the normal node, and I'll just plug this guy in. Now here I'm in SD6, so I'm just going to use the force alpha to 1 option, and then just plug this here into my normal. And then so right here in my 3D view, you can start to see what we're getting here with this. And then like I said, I have this histogram range node, so let me plug this guy in. And what this guy is doing here, now let's do it this way. Instead of just using this value completely, let's use this histogram range node and plug it into the normal like this. So this guy's also going to affect our normal as well. And let's see, I don't think it's going to show much until I come over here to my materials. So I'm not really seeing any height information, like I'm just seeing my normal. And so if you ever start to work with height and you're not seeing any change, you need to check your material. So here we'll come over to our material, and I'm just going to edit the default, and you'll notice here, sure enough, my scale factor was set at 0. So I just need to increase the scale factor, and I'm going to set this up to, let's try something pretty high, like well, 4 is way too high. So let's try something like this, and it's tessellating pretty bad, so let me check my shader here. So let's come over here to my definitions, and it's on tessellation, and I've got this tessellation factor I can change. So you can see that, if at the value that it was, we're getting some really jagged edges. So if I just start to tessellate this more, now it smooths things out a bit. Okay, so now that we actually have some tessellation with this, you can see that just by using this position slider, and hopefully you can see this work, I'm actually able to use this guy to, like I said, almost like a Z depth. So at this low position here, you can see that this is where the panel looks on the surface. If I want to raise this up, I now have just this simple position slider to push my panels forward. So it's almost like I'm just extruding them out of the surface. And that's a good way to think of it as well, because in the sense of what we're talking about here, we're talking about kind of hard surface details and building this up. So that's what this histogram scan does for me. It gives me a nice controller so that I can use the position almost like an extrude amount tool. And it's also pretty cool because if you're thinking about this in terms of like, in a modeling sense, this is all non-destructive. We can change this at any time. Now, in order to get it to work this way, you need to make sure that your range is just set all the way to 1, and then you're just going to work with your position. So like I said, we're talking about this in a procedural mindset. So now, if I come back over to, let's say, this splatter circular, and I change anything, like say here, let's just try changing the radius. Look, I'm getting a totally different result, which is really interesting. If I come back to that luminance random, if we drop this value down, it gives me the appearance of removing some of these panels. So here you can see that I'm starting to just get, totally different shapes. And like I said, we can expose these values, and you can have this totally, driven, user-driven, or I guess the best term is parameter-driven workflow here for creating this procedural panel system. And so what I'm showing here is the basis for how everything works that I'm going to be showing the rest of the time. So it's this entire mentality here where we're building up our height information, and then again we're using just this simple histogram with our position slider to drive the extrusion amount for this surface. So like I said, here I might pull this down a bit, and now this is maybe at the level I want this paneling system to be. Now, as you'll see as we start to build this material up, this paneling part is the lowest level on my height, because we're going to start adding more and more details to this height map. And you'll notice that once we do this, we want this paneling system to be, on the lowest level. All right, so that is how we just created the paneling. Now, the next step, let's see, I got an outer frame and the outer edge, and I don't remember which one of these I did first. Let's just do the outer edge. So you'll notice here, if I come over, I've got my shape here for the outer edge. Now notice here, it looks like I didn't really optimize this one. I left it at 1024. I'm not sure why I did that. Probably could lower that down. That might be a good way to look at what we have. So let's do this now. Let's do this. Just trying to think here, just for a second, on the best way to show what I'm doing. That's where we build up the frame. I'm just trying to show a way to do this little by little. Okay, here. Let me grab these two guys here. Move this over. And let's take a look at this outer edge frame. So what we're doing here, let's just plug this in directly so we can see it. So we should be able to do this and plug this into our height. All right, so here's our outer edge frame, and I'll just rotate my light here so that we can see this in the corner. So here's the kind of detail that we're starting to create here. Now, here's how this was done. We come in, I started with a shape. In this case, I don't even know if it needed to be a shape because it's just a full white image. Maybe I could have just used a uniform color for this. Because then what I'm doing is just using a transform here. So let's do that. So here you'll see I'm just making some changes as I work here. Just this would be part of the process where we're just looking at ways we could optimize this. So like I said, I'm using the shape node. Don't really think I need to do that. So let's just do a uniform color here. And you'll notice that I'm going to set this guy to absolute and probably try taking this down to, I don't know, let's see 32 by 32 and see what it does. Now, before I even plug this in, I'm going to come over here to this transform node and again set it to be relative to parent. And then I'm going to just plug this guy into here and replace him with this. And you'll notice here we ran into a small issue. So it's like all of a sudden that my detail got obliterated. And if I look, I can see here, well, okay, we did set this guy to be relative to parent, but you'll notice here that our blend mode is set to 32 by 32. And the rule behind that is whenever you have a blend node, it's going to take, let's see, if we have our blend node and it's set to input like it is here, it's going to take that resolution, that input resolution is always going to come with whatever you feed into the background. So even though we have a 1024 coming in the foreground and a 32 by 32 coming in the background, when this is set at input, it takes its resolution from the background. So here to fix that, relative to parent, and now we get our resolution back. So here's like what I was talking about. If I took this to say 128, 128, okay, you can start to see where this does have some impact on what I'm creating. So for example, at 128, I think this beveled edge that I have here is now a bit sharper than when I had this set to say 32 by 32. You can see that it softens it a bit, you know? So it just gives it a little, we're losing a little bit there. So this is when you have to make that decision on, I wonder, maybe it's best to just leave it at 128 by 128, you know? And then we could jog this up to 256, 256. What's this doing? Is it really that much of a difference? No, I don't think so. So, you know, might as well, if it's not much of a difference, let's lower the res. So let's do this instead of using that shape node. And this is going to be a bit less expensive than just using this shape node. Instead, I'm just using a uniform color locked at 128. So then here, I just use my transform to move this down. Okay, so here's another example. Why didn't I just do it like this? You know, you could come into the square and then I could have done this. So now you're in the thought of, okay, I could do two things with one node versus using two separate nodes to do something. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's all about designer. You know, you just got to make decisions like this as you go. I don't know why I had this transform in here. Probably when I was just kind of free-forming the concept of this material, I just threw a transform down so I could just work quick, and I left it that way. But for now, let's just leave it like this. But as you can see, always more than one way to do something in Designer. So here you can see that I take this shape, and this is something I do a lot when I'm creating hard surface stuff, because in my modeling programs, I like to work with booleans. And so I kind of bring that mentality into Designer. So whenever you have a white shape and another white shape together like this, so you can see I just scaled this down, what I'll do is just use the actual blend node with the subtract mode. So it's basically like I'm doing a Boolean subtract here. So this is, you know, we got a white square here, and then this full shape, and I subtract them, and this is the result that I get. So this is giving me my frame. Now, to introduce a bevel to this frame, I'm actually adding just a blur. Now, we also have a bevel node, and that would work just as well, but in my case, I just used this blur high quality. I just didn't want to use the bevel node, so I just used this. So the idea here is that I want to start to create more of a complex beveling hard edge with this, because the way that these highlights are going to hit, or the way these edges are going to catch highlights and add these extra little glints and blooms are super important. So we introduced in Designer 6 this new curve node. And so I'm going to enable this curve node just real quick, and you can see what it's doing. It's creating this really nice shape for me. And this is really key to doing these hard surface shapes. So if you have something like this and you want to use the curve node, you got to bevel it, because you need some of these grayscale values that you can manipulate with the curve. So that's why I'm doing it this way. Instead of using the bevel, I wanted to do something more custom, and I can get a lot more control, and I can get a better look by doing this with the curve node. So you have your shape, you have to bevel it so you can get some grayscale ranges, and then you can process it with the curve node. And this curve node here just gives me a simple curve editor, just like you'd see in Photoshop. And this becomes the profile here for my curve. So this is like the dark value. So here we go dark, and then it starts to ramp up. And then I've got this flat area here, which is this flat dark gray area. And then here I just go in kind of a accelerated ramp up here for this edge. And if I zoom in really close, you can see it's great how you get this dark gray, and then right here on this lip, there's this little white kind of area, and that gives me a really nice kind of, again, specular hit to that edge. So you can get, you know, really nice details with that. And so that's how this guy was produced for this edge. And so if I kind of back out, again, I can just use my kind of modeling material I have in that base material to kind of see what I'm working with here. So again, if I wanted to kind of test this and see what the specularity is looking like, I could easily come back over to this base material and just come over into this roughness, and here, let's just make it a little bit more smooth. And now you can see right here on these edges where the highlights are kicking off these edges and stuff. So it's just a quick way that I can test my material. I can see, well, how does it do when it's really rough? How is this edge working when, you know, I start to get a bit more smooth and so on. So again, that's why I like to use this from the start. All right, so that's how this outer edge piece was done. Now, the next piece that we have here is this guy, which I was calling the outer frame. So let's take a look at the outer frame. So we'll move our nodes over. This is our base material again. And let's plug him into the normal this time. And let's plug him into the height. And we'll take a look at what this little frame here is doing. So we'll move my light around, kind of zoom in on this guy, and let's check it out. Okay, so on this guy here, I'm just increasing the normal intensity so we could just get a little bit more of that value there. So to create the corners, again, you'll see pretty much the same kind of setup. So I started here with this polygon shape, here using that same technique, absolute 256. Like I said, that was the lowest I could go before I started to lose resolution. Now this time what I did, something a little different. I can't tell you why. I did bevel this time. So I used the bevel to get those edges. And then I used my transform node, and because the transform node is automatically set to tile, you can see that I just grabbed the transform widget and moved it with the center right here in this corner. And by doing that, you can see it automatically kind of replicated this shape to the corners like this. And then I used my curve node. So let's zoom in really close and take a look at the curve. So this is what we had before, just the beveled edge. And now here it is with the curve. And you can see, again, it ramps from black, ramps up. I use this kind of flat plateaued gray area here. That's what this piece is. And then we ramp up again to the white, to pure white, which is what this is. And so there's the curve. That's this piece here. Let's see. Now what I did was same thing again, because what I wanted to do was I wanted to cut a hole into this area here. And it's kind of hard to see what's happening in my 3D view right now. So like I said, I need more of my height information. So I want to cut a hole into this. So I started to build up my cutter shape. So you'll know, like, just using like your 3D programs like Maya, you know, you would, you got like a cube, you get another cube, and you're going to do a Boolean subtract. That's totally what I'm doing here. So I grabbed the transform, moved it into the area that I wanted, inverted the shape. I blur it just a little bit. So that gives me that transitional gray value. Run a curve on it. You can see I'm using the same little profile. And then I blend them together with the, this time I use multiply, because of the way that I wanted to add these guys together like this and subtract out that piece. So this time I get like this outer and inner kind of looped, kind of hard edge piece to that. So that's what this is. Then I'm coming in here with this corner mask piece. So you'll see that this is the beveling that I get for this. And actually, what I really should be showing here, yeah, let's do this. I think what I'm showing here was actually just a mask cutout. I'm sorry about that. So this is actually the shape that I'm really trying to create here, which is this guy. So before, what I should have been showing you was the result. I'm sorry, guys. Let me plug this into here. Plug this guy into here. All right. That is the actual shape that I was working with. So you can see what I was doing was I took that little piece there and this frame piece, and I'm blending them together using max lighten. And I use max lighten because now you can see where I'm getting a difference in my height values. So you've got this piece here, which is my frame, and now this corner piece is higher height value, so it's on top. And if memory serves me correct, yeah, okay. So you'll notice here that the way I have, like I was saying, you got to think about depth. And so I've got this frame piece here, and I wanted to have like a nice kind of lipped edge right in here. So instead of using that histogram scan, what I did was on my curve node, you can see that I took the final kind of point output, and instead of it being full white, so notice if I take this guy and I move it up, it'll bring these two on the same level. So now you get a different look. So now it almost looks like it's a fused piece instead of what it was before. So let me undo this. So I just took that white and just brought it down towards gray so that these guys are on different, we'll say different levels or planes basically. All right, so then what I had was the process of let's see, taking this shape here, and then that's what this piece here is. I'm just cutting the holes into that guy to get this. So then we'll come over and we'll grab this guy into our normal and grab this guy. So here's the effect that we get now. So I just wanted to cut a hole into that just so you could see something underneath of it, just a little bit more detail. And so that's those pieces there. All right, so kind of moving along, you can see that I then generate what I call the frame area. So here, okay, let's talk about the door section first. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to start to create this door section. So let's do this. Let me right click and view outputs in 3D view so we can see this. So what I want to do is I want to start creating kind of this door area here, like this. So to do that, you can see that I needed to start to create a shape. And the idea was I wanted to make this shape here. So the idea about making these shapes is I like to think of it almost like a positive subtraction type workflow. So I think, okay, well, I'm going to grab this guy here, which is going to be my polygon. I'll invert it, grab this guy here, and invert this guy, so you get different shapes all together. So you get these two guys. And then when I bring them together and I multiply them, these two inverted shapes multiplied gives me this shape. So it's just, again, a way to make shapes. Then from here, you can see that I did the same thing. I blurred and then ran a curves using this type of profile because I wanted to get a bit more, and if I zoom in really close on the shape, you can see just how detailed it is. And here, I'll zoom in, you can see even with my edge wear, you can see it's catching that nice little edge right into here and in here. So it's pretty powerful in how much kind of fidelity you can pull out of this. So this is the beveling profile that I created to do that. Then I wanted to create these little kind of little panel openings here. So it's, again, the same thing, a shape, a blur, and a curve. So here's the curve shape I get. You can see the bevel profile. This flat area is here. Then I just inverted it and then did a blend back over top. Is that what this is? Yeah, this guy's using a blend here. Actually, I think I see a mistake right in this. I don't think there's any reason to have this blend in here at this stage. So I should be able just to do this. Yeah, you can see this blend's actually doing nothing. So here's one of the things I did was I wanted to use my transform to put this shape on one side. And then just copied my transform. And to flip it or mirror it, we actually have a horizontal mirror button, which will just do that mirroring for you automatically, which is pretty cool. And then I just composited these two guys with a multiply to get them both on the same side. This right here, this levels is going to be creating a mask for me that I can use later. So you can see I'm just generating some masks that I'm going to kick out and use later. So that's all that is. But here is where we actually integrate these panels in. So you can see it's just a multiply piece. And now we've got this section here, which finally gets viewed or gets pushed down here into my plane. So like I said, I've got this plane view now. This frame. And here's where I use the histogram scan with my position. So range is at 1 in the position. And again, this position is used to control the depth so that I can move this up and down. And so a good way to kind of show that, here, let's do this. Let's grab this guy. So we can quickly output this here into our view. Let's do this. Let's plug him into here and plug this guy into the normal. And I'm just going to view this into my 3D view. Again, we've got that, just resetting my material before I do that because I have that emissive. All right, so here's kind of the shape that I have. Now, like I said, I've got this histogram scan here. And just so I'm not recomputing everything, let me grab another histogram range. Here's a shortcut as well. Instead of having to scroll up, I'm going to hold down the control key and left click on this output just to make a copy of it and pull it over into here. And let's do this. Let me just copy these two guys. Again, the only reason I'm doing this is just because I didn't want to, let's see. That should take care of it. Because I just wanted this to be kind of a quick compute. I don't want it to like have to generate all the other nodes that these nodes are connected to. So here you can see that I've got this histogram range. Let's set this all the way to 1 like I was telling you. And now I can move this guy back in space. So see how I'm dropping the panel? Back. If I push it forward, it'll actually move it up. So again, this is like, you know, a way for me to control that height depth just by using this histogram range. Really cool node for doing this. Okay, so here we'll just get rid of these guys for now. Whoops. We won't worry about it. Okay, so that gives us this shape. And that's what I'm creating my whole frame here. Now, the next thing that I want to do is create these holes that are going to be in the door. So let's check this out. Let's go into here, and you can see I've got these holes in this little door panel. So to create the door panel, here you can see I actually started with the uniform color. And I used my transform node and just moved it over. I had to set it to be no tiling for it to do this for me. And then I just took my other shape that I had from previous. It was this shape that we had. Just inverted it. And then here on my blend, I'm just doing a subtract to get this piece. So now you can see that this piece is my door. So then we blur it and we run a curves on it just to get kind of that nice edge. And then once again, histogram scan just so that I can control I'm sorry, I keep saying scan, I mean range, so that I control that height depth. And then here I've got a levels that I'm using for my mask. So here to create this transform, several ways you could do this. So instead of using like a tile generator, which I thought was just a little bit heavy, what I did was I just created a shape. You can see I made the shape as small as I possibly could. I blurred it, I inverted it, and then did a curve on it. Let's double click this guy and look at the curve. So this is the kind of nice curve. You can see hopefully it's clear in the video. I've got a nice little kind of white ring lip here. It goes a little darker, and then here is, so it dips in, and this is the kind of curve to create that. And then here I just use the transform to tile this. And if we zoom in, you can see that I've got not just a circle cutout, but one with a nice kind of lipped edge around it. So then we're just going to multiply this into our background, which is this guy, to put the whole shapes into here. And then I just used a transform and flipped it, and then blend those two guys together. So here's the holes that we get. Now you'll notice if I zoom in really close, because I put those nice kind of lipped edges when I run like my filters and such, you can see that it really, it starts to show on the edges of these circles like that. It gives them a nice little beveled edge. Really, really sells the effect. And like I said, you can do that pretty easily here by just using the curve node. It's always just like a blur and then the curve and then create your profile. Okay, so that's basically all of the pieces getting blended down. I'm going to show you the hoses here separately in just a moment. So after that kind of shape is created, and like I said, minus the hose, here you can see where I started to layer everything together. So we had this panel piece, we had our frame, we had our the paneling shapes that I showed at the very beginning, and we were just blending all these guys together here. So here, let me just check something here on the feed. Okay, all good. All right, so you can see that I start to layer up kind of like this complex height. And then from here, we're going to just generate our normal. So I'm just generating a normal. You can see I cranked the intensity up pretty high. Here, I'm just using the ambient occlusion. This is the horizon-based ambient occlusion, and it gives me just an excellent result right off the bat. And then here is where I blur my height. So for example, let's do this. Let me show you how this works. So if I come over here to my material, and I'll edit this guy, and I'm going to come up to my scale and set it to, say, like 4. And I'll increase my tessellation factor. So here you can see that I'm getting some pretty good displacement here in my 3D view. You can see where these bevel shapes are coming in. Let me just zoom in on it now. And let me move this light. There we go. So get some really cool beveling shapes here. I'm just super impressed by how good I can get these bevel shapes with the curve node. I just love that curve node. So the idea that, and I've talked about this a lot, is that the normal map is gonna give you all your high frequency detail. And the other part of it here is that we're going to use the height for the displacement part. And in that, I don't want to have like really fine-tune like high frequency detail in that height, because number one, you'd have to crank that tessellation up super high to retain that, and number two, it's just going to be real noisy. So what I do is I take my height, and you'll notice that this particular height minus those panels in the background, because they're small detail shapes, that's perfect type of shape for the normal map. What I want to do is focus on the overall silhouette of that shape. So that's why I have my height, and then I just blur it. So, it just gives me a nice blur effect, which again just helps with that silhouette shape. So anyways, just checking a question here. Okay, one question about the cross sections on the hose follow the curvature of the hose. Let's see. Which section? Oh, you mean is it these little sections here? Because they do get kind of distorted in this area. So just let me know if that's what you mean there in the comments. Do you want them to kind of follow the curving here of this? Okay, so kind of moving on, and we'll come back to that question. This is, like I said, this is kind of the map generation phase to that. All right, so now let me just talk about the hose before we go into. Okay, so exactly, good one. Yeah, let's move right into the hoses now. And then we'll kind of cover that topic. So you'll see here that the cabling, there's quite a few nodes going on, but it's actually pretty simple. So the first thing I do here is I have a hose, and so let's take a look at this guy. So what I have is I first built this effect. Then I selected all, once it was working, I selected all the nodes. I did the right click, and you can say create a graph from selection, which is right. It's kind of grayed out, but you can do that. And so if I grab a hose node and I just bring it in, I like to do that when I create something that I think is going to be reusable or used several times in the graph. I always kind of offline it, basically, I kind of call it, so that it's something I can reuse again and again. And so now I've got this hose, and you can see that I've gave myself some parameters here for adjusting things like the Y. My depth, again, is just going to allow me to kind of move this guy in space. The overall roundness. So you can see if I put this roundness up, what it's doing is just blurring those edges a bit. Let's see here. Take this guy back down. This gives it more of a flat effect. Then I have this curve, so I can move my curve and my warp angle and the position of where I want to warp this curve. Let's see. That position. There you go. So you can see I can just get different types of effects here is the idea of this. Invert the position, so on. Then I have this kind of transform exposed. So it's part of the new kind of widget tool inside of Designer 6, the transform, so that you can now expose your transform so that you can move it around. And I get this nice widget instead of having to move sliders. So I could rotate and move this guy however I want. So let me show you how this was made. So if I go into this hose graph, so what I did was I took a gradient, and you can see this time again I just tried to minimize this to make it so that the performance would work pretty quick. So 32 by 256. Basically I need the vertical resolution and not the horizontal. Then I've got a histogram scan, which is really good for adjusting the overall position of this. So if we take a look at this histogram scan here, I'll plug this guy in. Let's see here. Let me grab my position. Contrast, I'll adjust it. Okay, so you can see the position. I can basically take my value and move it like this. So it gives me like a way to just animate this gradient value, and then I can sharpen it or blur it more based on that contrast. And so that's what I have here, and then I expose those values. Then I blurred it here because I was seeing some artifacting in the curve transition, so I just blurred it and I got rid of it. Then here's another shape node, and then I'm just using a directional warp based on this gradient. So this gradient is driving the warp for this particular shape. Then here we've got a little blur. You can see that the intensity of the blur, this gave me that roundness effect, just been exposed. And then here is where I expose the transform. So if you want to be able to expose the transform so that it can be used in another graph where instead of having to like, here, if I have a transform node, instead of having to come over and adjust like X and Y offset like this, you could just grab the widget here in the 2D view. All you have to do now is just expose the transform matrix and the offset. Now, let me just go out to my root level, and I want to show you this. I group it, okay, so that, because it's not something you really want someone to edit anyways, and you just have to make sure, so your identifier, you just have to make sure the name offset is in it. Same thing with the matrix. You have to make sure that matrix 22 is in it. Now, you'll see that if I come over and I just expose this guy, it's automatically going to give you that name. Now, if you wanted to use like a custom name, you'd have to do it like this. Like, let's just say it was like demo underscore. As long as you have an underscore and this matrix 22 and underscore offset, it'll work. So here, we'll just cancel that and pull that out. Okay, so that gives me kind of my hose, and oh, okay, good. Yeah, I think you could do. That's what I was thinking. Yeah, you could put the cross sections in before you warp it. That would be a good way to do it. See, like, and I'm gonna get to that section too, because that was one thing that you can see here, that it does follow it, but I'll show you the way I did it. It's probably not the best way to handle it. Let's see, we'll get to that here in just a second here. So I have, let's see. So this becomes like one of the hoses. And then you'll notice, like, I want to show you like kind of a trick here of something else that I did. So here I've got a blend. Let me do this. Let me copy this here, because again, I don't want it to like, process everything. So let me come over and double click this guy. All right. So you'll notice I've got a blend here, and then you've got this cropping area. So what's interesting is if I look at this, I can actually use this cropping area to kind of like, it's like a write-on effect or like a drawing effect. So I had this hose, and I wanted to get just like the tip piece of the hose, so I just cut it by doing this. And then you'll notice that I have this uniform color set at 16 and plugged into the background. It's not doing anything other than if you have a blend node, you never really want to have a blend node where you just have one of the inputs and leave like either background or foreground empty. It just internally in the engine, it just has a little performance hit. I don't really know why, but that's just what the engineers told me. So you just want to, make sure that if you're using a blend, you need to make sure you have both foreground and background occupied. So that's why I just threw a uniform color in there just to do that. Okay. So there I was using it to get these little pieces at the end. Oh, hold on. There we go. Let that catch up for me. And then these give me two little end pieces. And then I blurred them and put a little curve on them to kind of bevel it up to get a shape. That's what these little connector pieces become. All right. So to create this piece, and I'm finally going to get to the question that was asked. So to create like this little piece, what I did was I kind of did it this way. So you'll see that I have the curve here. And then what I'm doing is I'm just taking this curve piece and kind of chopping it up. So to chop it up, I took a shape like this, and then I used a transform, and then with the tiling mode, I just tiled it. You can see where I scaled the transform so that it gives me this type of shape. So really, it's just giving me like these white blocks. And then all I'm doing here is just multiplying it into that shape, and it's cutting into it. So the reason why it's kind of skewed is because my cross sections, which I'm using to like kind of subtract out, they're not really taking into effect the curve. So one thing I could try to do is warp this piece. So let's just try that real quick while we're doing it. Let's see. Let me try doing a... Let me try a directional warp and see if we can make this happen. So let's do this, and let's do this. All right, so see how like I start to increase my warp angle and it warps it a bit. So now what would happen if I grab my blend? Let's see. And we'll multiply it. Okay. Now here again, I'm getting that situation where my foreground is one resolution and my background is set to input. So I'll set it to parent. Now it's starting to follow the hose better. So here's what we had before, where you can see that it's just these cut sections like this, and they're just almost like they are directly multiplied, and it's just flat. So if I wanted to make this adhere to the warping of the hose like this, I could just use a directional warp like I've done here. So now you see how it's warping the line, and then that's following the hose a lot better. So that looks a lot more organic. So let's do this. Let's plug this shape into here and see what happens. All right, so that's following that shape a little bit better. Yeah, you're right. I think it makes it feel a little bit more volumetric, at least. Maybe not the best maybe not the best fix yet, but it does. It adheres to this shape. And this is something that I don't know why I didn't think of this. That was so stupid. This is something I do like in every other substance. Like if you have a shape like this, you have some kind of underlying height shape, and then you're putting another pattern over top of it, you always want to use the directional warp to warp that pattern like this so that it conforms itself to that shape. Yeah, so I should have done that to begin with. I don't know what I was thinking of why I didn't do that. So here, maybe I could try just adjusting the value somewhat. Yeah, that makes it look like it's actually following that hose a bit better. And if I kind of go like this, it's a little bit more extreme, but yeah, that's too much. But yeah, that's one way to do it. And like I said, this is a technique using this directional warp. You'll use this a ton because you're always going to be, if you can warp this shape and have it conform to the underlying shape. And like I said, I do that all the time. I don't know why I didn't think of it for this. Okay, so here I just wanted that to be in one little section, so I just used the shape as a cutter and then just multiplied it out just to get that little shape. So that's that hose piece. And then these guys are all the same thing. I just copied them, different variations of the hoses, and then just used transform to move them around. So eventually I just kind of built up a little hose system like this. And then here you see that again I'm using that histogram scan with the position so that I could move the hose and make it so see how these little connector pieces, they're right behind the edge of this lip here. If I zoom in, they're right underneath that edge lip. I was able to get that by just decreasing the position so it dropped that height depth or whatever and fix that. Okay, so that gives me kind of like that height piece. Then what I did was I just set up a bunch of different colors. What did I do? Oh, I just used the base color, so the base color node. Just a bunch of these different guys, and then they're just masked. So you can see like this one is using, I'm sorry, they're not masked. They're using the normal, ambient occlusion, and height. All of them are using that as input. And then I have these different colors. And then I'm using the material blends to place them. So I'm blending two different materials together based on some kind of input. So here I just make a mask. And like I said earlier, I was making the mask like from this, inverting levels to crunch it down. So this is where I want to put a certain color value and so on. So nothing really sophisticated here. It's just using the material blend. And then you'll see that here is again another material blend, this time using a mask. This is for like a grunge wear. So it's actually using the metal edge wear so I can put scratches on everything. Another thing that's awesome about working in Designer like this, I feel like, is that you can easily compute things like your curvature and your ambient occlusion on the fly based on the normal. So as things change, you can as things change, you can easily recompute these maps. Yeah. So another question, some sort of Bezier curve path follow node. Yeah, that would be awesome, and I can experiment with that some more because I think there could be more sophisticated options to do stuff like that. So yeah, it would be something else to kind of look into. Like we don't have a specific like path follow node or whatever, like a replicator node. But yeah, there could be other ways to do that. Another thing to kind of look at might be you might get an even better result by using the vector displacement. So like if you just real quick while we're talking about it, I'm sorry, not displacement, vector warp. So vector warp, we could maybe take that, extrapolate some normal information, so we have more vector information, and then warp it based on that, which might give us more of a volume type effect versus kind of the skewing that we're getting with the directional warp. So that could be another thing, another way we could use that. So yeah, these here again, like I said, are just really simple color nodes. And then I expose like my base color in my information so that the user can change those values. And then I'm just using a mask to mask where the colors are going to be. So those are really simple. Another thing I wanted to talk about though was, okay, here's something I want to talk about that I think is pretty important. So here, when you use this mask generator, so I noticed when I published this substance the first time, and I wasn't even thinking about this. So I published the substance, and I'm using the mask edgeware generator. And I noticed like my substance was like 13 megs. I was like, what? I mean, this thing is fully procedural. Why is it like 13 megs? And oh yeah, see, no problem. Not sidetracking at all. It's your questions are awesome. I really appreciate it. I love to get this kind of like back and forth, and I don't mind jumping off topic or anything like that. I think that's where we're really sharing knowledge and stuff, and that's the best way to handle it. So no problem at all. Please, anybody have questions, just ask. Don't feel like you're going to interrupt me. I really don't mind. Okay, so I was looking at it, I was like, it's 13 megs. What? There's no bitmaps. What am I doing? So then I remembered the metal edgeware. So when you look at your mask generators over here, the dirt, I think dirt's okay. But if you're using the metal edgeware, there's actually, if you open that up, there's actually bitmaps embedded into that, like these grunge maps. So it's actually not just all procedural. It's actually based on like real grunge maps. And there's 2 of them. And so that's where, when I publish my substance, those bitmaps have to come along for the ride. So that's why my substance was so large. But I still wanted to use this generator. So this generator has a really awesome feature in it, which allows you to use a custom grunge map. Where is it? Where level? Grunge inputs right here. So you can see that I actually have a grunge input in here. What did I do? Here, let me drag a copy of this guy out here. So they have 2 versions of it. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. I'm not sure what happened with the version I have, but you got this use custom grunge and you enable it, and it enables the input. So I don't know why it's like invisible here. That's weird. But yeah, you should be able to just enable the custom grunge. And so that's exactly what I did. And I made my own grunge map and tried to mimic what that one grunge map was. So basically it looks like scratches. I used the scratch generator, blurred it with levels, grunge map, and then just came in and just processed it to get some of this edge grungy wear. And so that's what I'm actually kind of feeding down into this grunge map. So now it's using a grunge map that kind of matched what the other internal grunge maps are, but I don't have to worry about it being embedded as a bitmap. And so you can see if I zoom in, I like some of this kind of detail that I have in there that's working here for my scratch. It actually looks even better if I switch this to 2K, but I'm going to leave it at 1K so I can process things a little quicker. All right, so next, that was an important thing to think about. Like I said, I use the dirt a lot to put just dirt on areas. Yes, that's correct. So the grunge map that I'm creating is procedural rather than a bitmap. So that's why I did that. Because like I said, when you use metal edgeware as a generator, it has 2 bitmaps embedded in it. So when you publish your substance, it's gonna be larger. When if you have a fully procedural substance, you want it to be like nothing. It should be like 8 kilobytes. And so instead of doing that, like I said, I enabled the grunge input, so you can have a custom grunge input, and then up here I just made my own using procedural nodes so that it just bypassed that grunge. Oh, I'm sorry guys, now I know what I did. I'm crazy. Okay, so like I said, I had two versions here. So what I did, if you just right click, you can see that I can click this link here and bring my window over. This is where all the packages are. So I went and found Metal Edgeware and just did a drag and drop and pulled it out. And then opened it up and saw where those bitmaps are. I removed them from the substance. And then that's why I don't have that input for the grind. I'm sorry, I forgot what I did. Then I removed them and then just set it to where it would always just use this grunge map input. And then I gave myself an input here and then just put that in. You can, if you look at the substance, you can totally see how it was done. It's a small, simple substance. So like I said, I just moved them out. So when I publish, I didn't have to worry about those bitmaps. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to show you guys that I thought was kind of interesting was the way I did this emissive. So the idea here is that I wanted to have some of this emissive information here. So I have to start with some masks. So again, I just go and generate some masks. Here's some from that panel. So if I go let's just chase this guy back, see where he's coming from. Way back here. So again, remember when I made that little shape for the paneling? I just ran a levels to kind of get this detail. So here's what we had before. Let me load it up. And then ran a levels to kind of crunch it down just to get this shape. And I'm going to help use that when I generate this mask. So we'll move this guy down here. Okay, so then I just blended these two guys together so that basically all of this stuff is going to be where we place, or where I want to see some of this emissive. So I want to block stuff. So here I'm just multiplying it in. Now, it's cool that I put the hoses in front of that, so I want to make sure that I have another kind of mask here that I can then multiply down to remove that effect. Then I created this tile generator here, which looks like this. Just a bunch of this little pattern here. And then I ran this contrast luminance on it just to get something looks like a crossword puzzle. And then just blended it down into this guy to get some of these shapes here. So you can see its foreground is this is my background, and then I just multiplied it in. So now I get just these little holes. And you can see that these are showing up, but they are only in certain places, and they kind of fit within these panel lines. And then here, I just give it a color, and this color is exposed so that the user can change it. And that's how we do that output there. And then, like I said, I made a ton of these parameters that we can work with. So what I want to do now is just show you how some of these parameters work. So let me just open this guy here in Unreal Engine because I want to talk a little bit about the rendering process for this. All right, so bear with me for just a moment. I'm just opening up Unreal. I meant to have it started before I go. Now it's doing a stupid update to the launcher. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have opened it from the launcher. I could have just opened it from the project. It'll be just a second. Sorry, guys. All right, it's almost there. Here we go. So here, let me launch Unreal Engine, and then I'm just going to open up this little project where I brought this guy in because I want to show you some really cool variation you can get with this substance here. So we're going to open this guy up, and again, sorry, it's initializing the engine. Unreal Engine's like a beast on my machine. Like, you know, it's like if I have it open for too long, it's like you can, like, all the fans are kicking on even when I'm not using it. So it's like I try not to keep it running as much as if I'm not really using it. All right, it's almost there. Okay, and let's open up the project now. All right, so the project opens really quick. So yeah, like I said, once I had all this stuff together, I then just publish this out. One thing I do want to show you guys. So like I said, I use these kind of utility nodes a lot. Like I call them utility nodes because it's just creating something. So I don't want this to become a material when I import this into, say, Unity or UE4. So what I do is I come over to the attributes, and I always set its output computation set to no. This means that like when I import this into Unreal, Unreal only sees panel 01 as a material. It doesn't even see this, but it still works. Okay, so here's Unreal Engine, and let's bring him over to here. And so this was a substance I was troubleshooting. So let me grab my substance. There we go. All right, so here's the substance working inside of Unreal Engine. Here's what it looks like. Now, this substance and this floor substance, it's the same one. It's the same material that we just worked on. So let me show you how this works. So if I come over to my panel instance, I'm going to have some parameters I can work with. And now these are all the parameters that I exposed. So for example, if we want to come in here to, let's say, let me scroll down here, and there is, let me look at my controls here. Okay, I'm just going to leave it like it is now for the emissive. So here, let's move this back up, and I'm going to look at like, let me just close some of these guys for now. So these are all the material colors here. And then this is my panel components. So for example, these side compartments, I've got two sitting here. If I want to make this into 4, I can choose my 4 option, and now it splits those into 4. Also, you can notice that it's masking the it's already masking that emissive for me. So I can make that change. I can adjust the size. So here, let's decrease the side panels here, and so you can see it's giving me this effect of like closing the door. And let's take the center disk and close this guy. And let me change this back to 2 because this guy's repeating. So let me do this. And now you can see that I'm kind of closing this door, but it's also giving me, here, let's take my center disk and move this all the way to 0. So now I get just this loop, and I can now, you know, almost like open and close this door. And you can see that as I do that, it starts to reveal some of the paneling, and we pull it back some more. And here, we'll eventually get to that kind of grate where we had the holes. So now we're starting to see where our holes are, and again, because I was using that histogram range with that position, we start to have that depth. Yeah, that's you'd have to do some serious optimization, I think, for VR with some of these things, especially if you wanted to change this stuff at runtime. I don't even know if that's possible, but it's really cool that, you know, that I can make this type of all these types of changes like this. So here we can just close the door all the way completely here, and we can get rid of that. Or we can, like I said, switch our paneling here to, let's say, 4, and get something like this here. And then, of course, we can change all of the, we can change all of the colors and everything. So again, the other thing I did was I came down here to my materials. This is my paint. So maybe for my paint, I'll make it something like this. You know, there's just so many changes you can make to this guy here. And so here, let me close this one out, and let me go back to this panel instance too. And so this is the one that you can see where I was able to go in and start to change some of my values here. So here you've got like this roughness amount value for the floor. So if I start to decrease this, we'll get a little bit more shiny here on the floor and so on. So like I said, this floor substance is this same substance that I've created with that panel, and just by changing the parameters, I get a totally different look. You can see where some of the remnants of it are still there. Of course, we've got these edges, but you know, it's really cool that we can, you know, set it up this way. So the other thing I wanted to kind of showcase with this is some of the material setup. So let's see, where is this guy? Here it is. Sorry. So here's my material editor, and I want to show you a couple of things that I did with this guy. So let me just move this around. So one of the things that I do with my emissive so that I can get that nice blooming glow in the emissive is that I take the emissive texture here and I just multiply it by a constant value. So you can see here's the color, multiply it by a constant value, and then that's what's output to the material. And now I could make this as a parameter that I could control. Another thing that I said, like I'm actually going to tile this. So in order to tile it, you need to use a text coordinate node. So here you can see I'm using text coord. Here, we'll get to that in just a moment. One of the things I'm also doing here is I'm using the bump offset so that I could get some of that kind of displacement. So what I do is I use the bump offset, and you can see that it's using my height as the input from the red channel. And then I just set up a little bit of some parameters here for the tiling. So the way I do the tiling is I'll create a tile U and a tile V parameter. I append these two guys together, and then I multiply it by the text coord. Now I can have U and V tiling. So for example, if I come into here on, let's say, the U and switch this to 2, let me just hit apply real quick. You'll see that this is going to tile on the U. Hopefully without having to build shaders. There we go. So now you can see I just tiled it on the U coordinate. So that's how that works. Okay, so this right here is taking care of my tiling. That's what this is. Then the bump offset, what it does is it takes a coordinate. So you got to have some kind of coordinate. No, if I didn't want to worry about the tiling, I just would have fed this text coord right into here. And then I take my height, put it into the height, and then the output of this is going to go into the UVs of all my textures. So like I said, this is just letting me work with this displacement here. And in this case, I'm just using, it's like a parallax occlusion. It's not actual tessellation in this case. And if I come over and take a look at my surface, see no tessellation is being used. I'm just using the bump offset. So again, that's the same as if I were to use the parallax occlusion shader inside of Substance Designer. So let me jump over here real quick in case you aren't familiar. In the materials definitions, you go to physically based metal rough, you have a tessellation and a parallax. So what I'm using in UE4 is the equivalent to this parallax occlusion shader. And that's my material setup here. Here you can see that I was actually setting up one to work for displacement as well, but I ended up not using that. Okay, so another question, because it's procedurally, when you tile it non-uniform, it shouldn't introduce any distortion, correct? It will introduce distortion. Like you can see, it is distorted here because in the end, what we're outputting is we're outputting actual texture maps that are being applied to the UVs. So internally, everything is being generated procedurally, but at the end, the final output of it is that you're getting, you're getting textures, which are then going to be, they're then going to rely, or that distortion is going to happen because again, they're just textures. So yeah, you're still going to have that issue. Like here, you see that stretch that I'm getting. Okay, so yeah, and to fix that stretch, what I would need to do is, like, say I wanted to tile this, what I do with this one, go by 2, and I'd have to do an offset of this one. So maybe 1.5 or do 2 as well, depending if I want a square or non-square. So this is square, it would have to be 2, but that's how that works. Okay, so I don't want to save this. All right, one last thing. I'm sorry, guys, I'm running over a bit. I don't want to keep you too long. It's just something I've wanted to kind of share in the... okay, so here, this is another really good question. So the textures are rasterized before being applied in UE4. No, they're not. So that's another thing that's kind of weird about it. Not weird, but it's just the way Substance works. So these textures that you see here, these are textures that are being generated, but at this stage, these textures are not rasterized to disk. They're actually being held in video RAM. So yeah, they're rasterized on the card on the GPU, but they're not rasterized as far as being like a texture that's saved to disk. Now you can change that behavior within the settings. So for example, if I come over here to, I think I have to go to project settings. Let me bring this guy over and we scroll down to substance. You'll see that we have what we call the default generation mode. So here, let me expand this. And you have different effects. So right now, it's just going to use whatever the platform default is. But then you have this ability to load async and synchronously and cache these textures. So if you hit cache, it will also then rasterize that image to disk as well. So right now, it's only being held within the video RAM. But it does get rasterized on the GPU as so it can be rendered as a texture. Okay. Last thing I just kind of want to talk about was my overall lighting setup from working with things out of Substance in UE4. So what I'll do is I create a skylight, and I have here you see I'm using the small apartment. This is just one of the HDR maps from Substance that we ship with. So I just grab those, and I use that as the specified cube map. And then I have my light probe set up here in my scene. Where is that guy? Here. And now in this case, for my reflection probe, I am using the specified cube map, and I use this cube map here for the reflection part of it. So that becomes my whole setup. I'm actually not using like a directional light in this particular scene. So everything's just being lit by whatever that HDR map is. Okay, so that is going to conclude this webinar. Like I said, guys, I went over about 15 minutes on this one, so I'm sorry. It was a lot to cover. It took a while. So anyways, I want to thank everybody for their time. A lot of excellent questions. Effects Animator, thank you very much for your questions. Those are really good, and I'm happy to address those. Again, as always, if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to email me directly. Also, Charles will be sending out a recap email, and he will be sending out links to this video, so it's always archived on YouTube now, so that you guys can. But it's unlisted on our channel, so you won't be able to find it. But we send you guys the link to them. One other thing I'd like to mention, if you guys want to play around with this Substance, it's on Substance Share. I placed it on there, so if you just do a search for my name, you'll see it under there. And actually, I'll have Charles send the link to it just in the recap email. So thanks very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. You guys have a great weekend, and I will see you next time.